The summer newsletter from the Maplewood Homeowners Association arrived in every mailbox with the usual tone of cheerful dictatorship. Rules about grass height, reminders about pool hours, and, this time, one new decree. Effective immediately, all lawn ornaments are prohibited. For most residents, it was just another absurd line added to the ever-growing list of restrictions. Flamingos would vanish, garden fairies would disappear, and quirky bird baths would find their way into garages. But for Henry Lawson, the widower, at 72 Maplewood Lane, it was something else entirely. Henry's wife, Margaret, had adored her garden. She was the kind of woman who could coax roses into blooming in dry soil and sunflowers to stand proud even in the face of storms. When she passed away 3 years earlier, her favorite garden gnome, a chubby red-capped fellow holding a lantern, remained at the heart of her flower bed. For Henry, it wasn't just an ornament. It was her presence. When the HOA demanded he remove it. Henry stood still in his yard, staring at the little gnome glowing softly at dusk. "They'll have to drag me out of here before I let them take you," he whispered. But the HOA had power, and Henry was about to find out just how far they would go to enforce it. 2 weeks after the rule was announced, Henry received his first letter. Notice of non-compliance. The letter, signed by HOA President Constance Whitaker, carried the sharp edge of authority. Constance was known in Maplewood as a woman who wore pearls even while gardening and treated HOA bylaws as scripture. The letter threatened fines of $50 per day until the unauthorized ornament was removed. Henry crumpled the paper in his fist. His gnome wasn't just decoration. It was the last conversation piece with Margaret. Neighbors stopped by often to tell him how much they loved Margaret's lantern. Children paused on their way to school to wave at it. It had become a part of Maplewood's story, more than the manicured hedges or cookie-cutter paint palettes. When Henry ignored the first letter, a second arrived. Then a third, this time with an official seal threatening legal action. Constance herself stopped by one morning, her heels clicking sharply on his walkway. "Mr. Lawson," she said, looking past him toward the flower bed. "It's a violation. You're setting a bad precedent." Henry crossed his arms. "That gnome stays. Margaret planted every flower around it. If you want it gone, you'll have to explain to her why." Constance pursed her lips. "Don't test me, Mr. Lawson. The board doesn't lose." But Henry wasn't afraid of losing. He was afraid of forgetting. News spread fast in Maplewood. Soon, the community was split between those who supported Henry and those who backed the HOA. The Lawson yard became a rallying point. Neighbors left flowers at the base of the gnome. Others tied ribbons around its lantern. A retired teacher made a sign that read, "Let the gnome stay." On the other side, Constance and her allies doubled down. They argued that lawn ornaments lowered property values, disrupted uniformity, and would turn Maplewood into a tacky carnival if allowed to remain. She reminded residents of the HOA's vision: order, elegance, prestige. Henry found himself the reluctant figurehead of a neighborhood rebellion. Local news even picked up the story: "Widower battles HOA over garden gnome." Constance fumed. "You've turned this into a circus," she shouted at a board meeting, where residents packed the room. "No," Henry replied calmly. "You turned it into a battlefield the day you forgot that neighborhoods are made of people, not just property values." The room erupted in applause, but Constance wasn't done. She filed suit against Henry, dragging the gnome into court. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale air. Henry sat at the defendant's table with his pro bono attorney, a young lawyer named Rachel Meyer, who believed in fighting unjust HOA practices. Across from them, Constance sat with her legal team, smug in her pearls. The case, officially titled Maplewood HOA versus Henry Lawson, was surreal. Exhibits included photographs of the gnome, bylaws about decorative restrictions, and testimony about neighborhood aesthetics. Constance argued fiercely, "If we allow this ornament, we open the door to chaos. Lawn integrity is the backbone of property value," Rachel countered. "This isn't about property value. It's about control. The HOA has overstepped its authority. Mr. Lawson isn't violating health or safety. He's preserving a piece of community history and honoring his late wife. The judge, weary-eyed but attentive, listened as neighbors testified. Some defended Henry passionately. Others, afraid of slippery slopes, sided with Constance. Then Rachel dropped a bombshell. Through discovery, she had uncovered HOA financial records. They showed Constance and her board had been funneling association funds into personal accounts under the guise of beautification projects. The courtroom gasped. The gnome had led them straight to corruption. The trial shifted overnight. What began as a fight over a garden gnome became an investigation into embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power. Rachel presented evidence of inflated contracts for landscaping companies secretly owned by Constance's relatives. She showed receipts for community improvements that never materialized. Thousands of dollars had vanished into private pockets. Constance's face turned pale under the fluorescent lights. "This is irrelevant," she barked. "We're here about a gnome, not finances." But the judge disagreed. The HOA's credibility crumbled. The courtroom buzzed with outrage as neighbors realized their dues had been stolen to fund Constance's luxury vacations and renovations. Henry leaned back in his chair, looking at the little photo of Margaret he kept in his wallet. She would have smiled at this moment. The gnome had outlasted them all, forcing truth into the sunlight. By the end of the week, Constance was removed from her position, and the HOA faced state investigation. The judge dismissed the case against Henry, ruling the ornament restriction unreasonable and selectively enforced. The gnome was safe. But the neighborhood would never be the same. Months later, Maplewood looked different. The HOA was restructured under new leadership with fairer rules and actual transparency. Neighbors spoke more openly, united by the battle that had once divided them. Henry still tended to Margaret's garden every morning, the gnome's lantern glowing softly at dusk. It had become more than an ornament. It was a symbol of resilience, memory, and community. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Henry sat on his porch while children played tag across the lawns. A little girl stopped by, pointed at the gnome, and asked, "Mr. Lawson, why do you keep that funny man in your garden?" Henry smiled. "Because he reminds me of someone very special, and because he helped us all remember what matters more than rules, each other." The girl nodded solemnly, then skipped away. The gnome's lantern flickered, as though Margaret herself were still watching over Maplewood, and so the last garden gnome remained, silent, steadfast, and eternal.